Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Americans Learn. Today, we are going to be watching how America became an empire. This is the fourth in the prehistory of the beginning stages of the Pacific War. As always, joining me is none other than my good friend, Daniel. How are you,
Hey
Daniel?
guys, good to be back. Another episode. I gotta say, it's like some part of me is grown up is always like, okay, let's get to the actual war part. But I'm just enjoying just going over the context that led to it. I think it's
Yeah.
something that people don't take enough time to like learn and talk about. I'm really so happy that the channel is has taken the time to really do this prehistory because it just makes the context of what happens so much more real, and I think to some degree so much more obvious.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm really excited to learn how uh, we eventually get involved in Pacific theater. So, this is how, I guess, the American perspective of how we ourselves also became an empire.
It's real funny because I'm sure if they're going to go through the Spanish claims, which I believe they went through in that other episode, I think it was the episode 2, maybe, how it's like oh, the Spanish blew up the Maine, even though we sort of were the ones responsible for that.
Faulty maintenance. That's
Yeah,
all it was. Faulty maintenance.
yeah.
It wasn't any kind of secret landmine or sea mine. It was just people just didn't know how to maintain the ship. Okay, so there you go.
Meanwhile, Japan's like, "Hey guys, we're gonna try and blow up this train, then blame it on China." Or America's like, "Hey, we didn't maintain our ship, and now we're gonna blame it on Spain."
The hell with Spain. Remember the Maine. The hell with Spain. So there you go. All
Yeah.
right. So without further ado, then I'm excited to play this video. So let's get started with it and enjoy it. Be sure to support the original content creators, Kings and Generals, and let's get started.
So far in this series, we've been mainly covering the history of the Japanese Empire prior to the start of the Pacific War. But what about the other major player of the war? What was the position of the United States after the end of World War I? What were their interests and strategies in the Pacific? And how did they feel about their future rival and its rise as a great power? Today we're going to answer all these questions and more as we cover the history of the United States and its role in the Pacific Theater. And if you're interested in the history of the World Wars, you have to check out the Battlefields of the World Wars series on the sponsor of today's video, Magellan TV, which is our most loyal partner and the documentary platform of choice of the Kings and Generals team. This 8-episode series covers the 8 most decisive battles of the World Wars, including Verdun, the Bulge, and Dieppe, with a heavy emphasis on tactics and technology. Our favourite documentary in the series, called Angels of Victory, talks about the events of D-Day. You can join us and watch this documentary by using our link in the description. Magellan TV has more than 3,000 documentaries waiting for you, and hundreds of them are on the history of various eras. New ones are added weekly, and all of them are in 4K and available on most devices, including phones and PCs. If you're a history fan or have friends and loved ones who are, a Magellan TV subscription is a great, thoughtful gift. Magellan TV has an exclusive holiday offer for our viewers. Buy one, get one free gift card for an annual membership by clicking on the link in the description. You won't regret it. Magellan TV is great.
So, just want to pause real quick. I'm pretty sure that promotion no longer is valid.
Yes, that's a thing. So sorry, folks. Sorry. But be sure to support the original content creators. So there you go. Now let's get started with Pacific War.
Since its inception, one of the primary objectives of the United States has been to secure America's commercial interests in the world, without hesitation to use force to preserve its trade, and only bothering to intervene in conflicts if they impede American profits. Yet expansion...
Never forget Smedley Butler, the greatest unsung hero in U.S. history. He again, war's a racket. That man is a hero. And I wish more Americans just knew how truly patriotic and heroic he really was and what he believed in. And it's a shame that not a lot of Americans just know what kind of an example he truly is. So there you go. Anyways.
Wasn't rare in the early history of the US, albeit not by force of arms in most cases. Following independence, the Manifest Destiny Doctrine urged Americans to expand in a westward direction until getting to the Pacific Ocean. With the purchase of Alaska, westward expansion finally ended, but the Manifest Destiny did not. As in the late 19th century, it evolved to promote an overseas expansion directed to the acquisition of Pacific Island groups. Commercial interests in the Far East also helped to fuel this extension of the Manifest Destiny, with the US participating in the forced establishment of trade in China, Japan, and Korea via the unequal treaties through the decades. As the United States resisted getting itself entangled in Europe's perennial wars, a sphere of influence was gradually created over its own continent, and the US soon started to grow as a world power. This,
if you ever want to see old school cartoons like from that time era, I urge everyone to check out like at the FDR estate in New York. He collected a lot of the like a lot of these old school these old school political cartoons. So I just something to throw out there. I mean, the imagery looks hilarious enough as it is.
I love Americans like Europe, the size of America. You stay there. We America, I control 2 continents. Stay away.
Go stay on that side. Stay on that side.
Speaking of unequal treaties.
Yeah. Speaking of which, that whole Manifest Destiny, it's not cash money. So there you go. And that's
I mean, technically it was cash money. It just depended on which side you were asking. The other side, it was very much genocide. But
yeah, exactly.
It was very cash money for Americans.
Yes.
Sphere of influence then expanded into the Pacific, where the Americans found great interests on the Hawaiian archipelago, which would eventually cause the collapse of the Kingdom of Hawaii and its subsequent annexation by the US, an event that coincided with the outbreak of war with the Spanish Empire over Cuba. From this war, the United States also obtained the Philippines and Guam in the Pacific, yet these territories were not to be new states. Instead, they were basically declared as colonies, not enjoying full constitutional rights under American rule. The newly born American imperialism in the Pacific would continue with the colonization of the eastern islands of Samoa and the main islands surrounding Hawaii. In East Asia, the Americans opted to cede the initiative to the Europeans, with the objective of securing the little presence they had in the region, while at the same time helping important states like Japan or China to modernize and thus become a counterweight to European encroachment.
Okay, pause it.
In result,
so I know they say it's basically a counterweight to Western encroachment. What they really mean is we would like someone to trade with. We don't need to take over and colonize the same way that Europe does. Mm-hmm. We just want to have commercial rights to everything you have. But oh man, did America's desire to modernize Japan really cause a lot of things America didn't expect? Mm-hmm. I'd hope we learned from that lesson since then.
Yeah, what could possibly go wrong?
Yeah, no, it's like, America always makes countries' lives better when we take control of their government. I mean, so I don't get it. It should have worked.
Try and true. If you don't succeed the first time, try again.
Relationships with the Qing dynasty and the early Meiji government were very amicable, with the US promising to intercede on their behalf in the face of renewed European aggression. But when the Japanese Empire quickly began to manifest its own imperial ambitions, the Americans had to act to prevent war between Japan and China, consequently damaging American-Japanese relations. After the outbreak of the Sino-Japanese War, however, the US helped to broker peace between them with the Treaty of Shimonoseki and refused to join the Europeans during the Triple Intervention, again becoming one of the friendliest powers to Japan. In 1899, after a scramble for concessions in China, the Secretary of State, John Hay, established a new American foreign policy aimed towards East Asia. With the open door policy, the US wanted to preserve Chinese territorial and administrative integrity as a buffer against intensifying conflicts in the region and to secure American commercial, rail, and navigational access to Chinese markets. This skillful articulation of US interests probably slowed imperial expansion within China during and after the Boxer Rebellion. Yet it wouldn't be enough to deter Russian and Japanese aggression, leading to the outbreak of the Russo-Japanese War. Once again, the Americans would have to intervene to end the war and maintain a favorable balance of power in the region during the negotiations at the Treaty of Portsmouth.
Again, President Theodore Roosevelt, an outstanding character, a person who lived a full life. And you know what? There's everyone talks about how he used to go on hunting expeditions, fight people, wrestle people, all that stuff. He was born very sickly. He had to rebuild his body as a young man, as a young kid, to become the person that, well, we all know him now. But my favorite story about Theodore Roosevelt is when he was married to his second wife, and when he became president after the assassination of McKinley and then won his first reelection, when asked if he'd run again, he said no. I forget how exactly he worded it, but his wife, like, more or less afterwards confronted, said, you know, what you just said was not how you are. You should have said that you were running for a second term. Dumbing it down, she's like, what were you thinking? Did you eat a breakfast? Because and he turned to her and said, "Yeah, you're right. That was pretty stupid of me to say that." So there you go. Which I have to wonder what would happen to America if he actually did run again for like a third term, because he would probably be done before the First World War broke out. So I think 1912 he would have. Let's see, he was president from 19. So another 4 years onto that, 1909. 9 and 4. 1913. Yeah, so he'd be done. He'd be done as president, I think, at that time.
Well, if he's entering the war, there's actually a decent chance he would have been able to run for a fourth term if it was during the war.
Huh. That's right, because there wasn't term limits. I wonder if, and instead of FDR being deemed as the first imperial president, we would see Theodore Roosevelt.
It's crazy that both of them had a real path to doing so. Just FDR is the one that took it properly.
Yeah, FDR is the one who took it because he ran for, of course, he died in his fourth term, but technically he ruled over this country for 16 years. You know, obviously he ruled only over for 12, but that's an alternate history I would like to see. If Theodore Roosevelt, instead of stepping down, actually ran again, and would he have run again for unprecedented for? But he died, but I think before the First World War broke out, I think.
Well, maybe in this alternate reality he doesn't. I don't know.
Yeah, because during that time, anyways,
yeah.
We'll create another YouTube channel for alternate history. So there you go.
What if?
What if? All right, there you go. But again, Theodore Roosevelt, outstanding character.
The very restrained peace terms negotiated by President Theodore Roosevelt strongly damaged American-Japanese relations, as Roosevelt supported the defeated Russians in their stance to concede little territory and to avoid war reparations. The Japanese expected these reparations to help families recover from lost fathers and sons, and to relieve the burden of heavy taxation. Without them, social unrest erupted in the country.
So
Roosevelt did this because he wanted the...
So it's like, again, America now twice has done peace negotiations with Japan where they really haven't given Japan anything, but at the same time, they're sort of the great powers, the best friends of Japan, even though they're really not.
Yeah.
The war to end with both Russia and Japan in a weak state. Russia humiliated and militarily weak, and Japan bankrupt and with unrest. The Japanese, however, managed to recover from the economic crisis and continued to modernize, as we've already seen. Worried about Japan's growing naval power after the war, the Roosevelt administration set out to improve its defenses in the Pacific and to embark on a large naval buildup capable of defending Pacific possessions from Japanese aggression.
Oh, pause that.
In the remainder of...
It's fascinating. I never really considered, as they're putting out here, that the reason that the U.S. was building up its Navy, which was very fortuitous by the time World War II came about, or I guess this is, if it's under FDR, this will be earlier than that, this would be World War I era. Anyway, but the point is that it was America's worry about the strength of the Japanese Navy that caused us to bolster our defenses there.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And let's face it, we have all those colonies and territories in the South Pacific. I guess it seems only reasonable to strengthen and fortify your defenses.
Of Roosevelt's presidency, an effort was made to improve relations with the Japanese. But despite the successes that American diplomats might have had,
Mm.
everything would change after the outbreak of the First World War. From it, the United States emerged as a great power, playing a key part in the
And for those of you who don't know, I didn't notice too until sometime when I was enlisted in the Marine Corps. But our old colors, they were actually there's a Marine Corps flag where it is during a certain time period it was blue instead of red.
Huh.
Yeah, I know. I was surprised by it too. And this was when I was in a recruit in boot camp. There's a Marine Corps museum at the San Francisco. San Francisco. No, San Diego. Duh, San Diego. Boy, I'm getting senile now. San Diego. A base. Or Marine Corps Recruit Depot. So yeah, there's a museum there, and there's a blue Marine Corps flag. It's not red. It was blue. I never knew that.
collapse of the German Empire at the end of the war. But despite President Woodrow Wilson's goal of world peace with the establishment of the League of Nations, his foreign policy in the Pacific would be poor and inconsistent.
Yep.
It was during this time that American-Japanese relations reached a point of no return, as the US condemned the 21 demands presented by the Japanese to China in an effort to increase their sphere of influence in the region. The growing tensions between...
Also, another thing about Woodrow Wilson and this jagoff, again, I have zero respect for Woodrow Wilson.
Terrible president.
Yeah. Oh, not only that, he's seriously bigoted. And another thing, too, there was a person who came to Woodrow Wilson and his administration when the League of Nations were finalizing the peace treaty that would last for so many years. This person came to Woodrow Wilson asking for help of his country's independence and growth away from French colonialism. And Woodrow Wilson just said, no, you can't self-govern and all this other stuff, because this person who went to Woodrow Wilson heard the stories of America, how it rid itself of the shackles of the British crown. And this person, his name's not important. You probably never heard of him, but he goes by the name of Ho Chi Minh.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Wilson.
No problem whatsoever.
Wilson put in the groundwork for what is now like big government.
Yeah.
He hurt Americans by not addressing any concerns, making everything worse. And he destroyed a lot of stuff in foreign, like stuff like this, like the way that he wanted. I can't say a nice thing about Woodrow Wilson.
He also played Birth of a Nation at the White House. That was one of his favorite films. So there you go. And I have of all the presidents, he's the one I despise. He's number one on my list. I just don't like Woodrow Wilson. There you go. And if that makes me a bad person, then hey, I'm a bad guy.
In Japan and the US then reached a climax at Versailles, forcing the Allied nations to strike a compromise during the peace negotiations. In exchange for the German leases in China and their colonies in Micronesia, the racial equality proposal presented by the Japanese would be rejected, mainly due to the opposition of the British and the US itself. This compromise was seen as a humiliation by both the Chinese, who believed that the German leases should return to them, and the Japanese, who felt alienated by the Western powers, and in response suffered a rise of nationalism and anti-American sentiment. Overall, however, Wilson would maintain the open-door policy towards China in a more friendly way, and would succeed at supporting democracy and self-determination in Asia and the Pacific, even going so far as to propose the decolonization of the Philippines. But the devastation of the Great War had an unforeseen consequence. It left only the US and the Japanese Empire as the main players in the Pacific. To preserve the open door, the Americans would now have to balance their own power in the region and that of Japan, and to increase the difficulty of their task, the Republic of China would also fracture into several warlord states, so the open door was...
It's interesting how many times China would be fractured apart numerous times.
It's their whole history. They break into pieces, then eventually come together, only to break into pieces, to come back together.
Yeah, yeah. It's again very very fascinating. So there you go. And never forget that's the Mongols who helped their influence and invasion into what would then be China and in Russia, forming both nations into different solid nation states. But then again, with China breaking apart again, they learned a lesson from the Mongols. Bring back Genghis Khan and his fantastic friends.
Was detrimental for Chinese territorial integrity. Meanwhile, the American Navy had been preparing for war with the Japanese Empire since.
Okay, again, this imagery, I love it. It's art, but maybe this is also my inner Warhammer 40K fan, but there's just like I could see this being like instead of a battleship, it could be a spaceship, and there's people cheering for the Emperor and that kind of stuff. Like some of this imagery, so because like the Warhammer 40K propaganda, and if you look at some of this too, if some person wanted to be really creative, be like, yeah, I could turn this into like Warhammer 40K propaganda.
It's funny. I just saw an image. We can't stick on this too long, but I just saw an image that's like someone's like, can you describe Warhammer 40K with one image? And so it's a picture of a bunch of Bradleys that are opened up in the back, and a lot of like Roman soldiers with swords are coming out.
Since the start of the century, developing and adapting their War Plan Orange through the years. Their plan initially involved the defense of their Pacific possessions from their base at Corregidor Island, while waiting for reinforcements to arrive from the Atlantic, as the US expected a sudden Japanese attack. Then advancing up the Caroline and Marshall Islands in preparation for a decisive counterattack against the Japanese Navy, the Americans would take Japan's home islands under blockade and then end the war. Thus, for the success of War Plan Orange, continued parity with the IJN in the Pacific and the fortification of US Pacific possessions was of absolute importance. If the Americans neglected these endeavors, they would then throw away an invaluable military advantage and risk prolongation of war, maximum expenditure, and uncertainty of outcome. But the Roaring Twenties were a time of great prosperity for the US, one in which naval spending had very little support, as the Republican governments instead focused on business prospects. By the end of the decade, the Americans had become the largest exporter in the world, expanding the size of its domestic market and becoming less dependent on trade, and to avoid a costly naval arms race with Japan, the US would turn to convene an international disarmament conference in Washington. Furthermore, the Anglo-Japanese Treaty of 1902 was an important matter for the Americans, so they would pressure Great Britain to terminate the treaty, leaving Japan alone and isolated. As such, they would be easily pressured into agreeing with the Washington Naval Treaty. The treaty itself, signed in 1922, established a 5-5-3 ratio in battleship tonnage for the US, Britain, and Japan, as well as a non-fortification clause in the Pacific. It also enforced the open door policy by making all the powers guarantee the commercial and territorial integrity of China. The treaty was thus a great success, securing American superiority against the IJN and managing to soothe Japanese aggression against China for the remainder of the decade. Yet in the long term, the treaty would render War Plan Orange completely ineffective, as the non-fortification clause left the US at a severe disadvantage in the Pacific, and in the 30s, Japan would begin to build up its navy again to compete with the US and to establish hegemony in East Asia. The Japanese would also see the growth of anti-American sentiment with the Japanese Exclusion Act of 1924, which closed off Japanese immigration to the US. This act further provoked the rise of ultranationalism and racist-driven fascism in the Japanese Empire, which would eventually lead to the decision to abandon disarmament and to prepare for war against the US.
Again, maybe all of this could have been avoided, but unfortunately, Woodrow Wilson, you jagoff, you just screwed it up.
Yeah, again, it's like I can't see, like I get, like I know, like so I know, like America did stupid things during the Depression that were you would count as maybe almost genocide, but like just rounding up U.S. citizens that didn't look white and going, okay, you're going to Mexico at gunpoint.
Yeah.
Or Chinese Exclusion Act, Japanese Exclusion Act.
Yeah.
We could have handled that situation a lot better than we did.
Yep. All this, maybe it could have been avoided, maybe not. You could what if, but maybe that's for alternate history and conversations for another day.
Mm-hmm.
The remainder of the decade, the US would try to financially support Japan to heal a little their poor relationship. But with the signing of the London Naval Treaty of 1930, which further established limitations on cruiser and submarine construction, the ultranationalists in Japan finally began their rise to power. The prosperous Roaring Twenties would also end very poorly, with the Wall Street crash of 1929 signaling the beginning of the Great Depression. What followed was a time of high unemployment, poverty, deflation, emigration, and economic crisis, poorly managed by the government of President Herbert Hoover.
I just want to say this too. My grandpa lived during this time, and he said it was pretty rough when the Depression hit. It was difficult, and people were starving. People were homeless. It was a very difficult time. And if anyone ever wants to see, like, for example, on the FDR museum, the estate there, they actually talk about the Depression. And were not for FDR and his New Deal, I have to say, folks, I don't know where this country would be at. So, yeah, it was a difficult time.
The 1932 election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, however, saw the establishment of an economic recovery plan, the New Deal, which would allow for much of the economy to recover by 1936, although the effects of the Great Depression would still be felt for many more years. In 1937, for example, the American economy would unexpectedly fall again, with a renewed decline of production, profits, and employment. FDR reacted by launching a rhetorical campaign against monopoly power and a $5 billion spending program to increase mass purchasing power. Luckily, the 1937 recession had ended by 1939, and the American economy was recovering once again. In the Pacific, meanwhile, the economic turmoil in the US coincided with the consolidation of ultranationalist elements in Japan, which launched a successful invasion of Manchuria, left the League of Nations, and abandoned the naval disarmament. Overwhelmed by the financial crisis at home,
everyone's in dire straits, so it's not going to be the biggest priority or even ability of like Great Britain or the US to do anything about that. They're all stuck focusing on internal issues.
Right. What could possibly go wrong? I hope that League of Nations sure stays around.
Hoover administration wanted no problem with Japan, so they allowed the Japanese to get away with it without enacting economic sanctions against them. As the open door was falling apart, FDR would also focus exclusively on more pressing domestic programs, resulting in the Japanese having a free hand to act in China. Furthermore, the American Navy was in a miserable state, with the Asiatic Squadron still using aged vessels from the Great War. Hoover and FDR would also cut down the Army and Navy budgets, and in Hoover's mandate, not a single ship would be constructed, further weakening the American military. In response, Congressman Carl Vinson, the main champion of a stronger Navy during the 30s, would work with Roosevelt's administration to use the naval buildup as a jobs program in accordance with FDR's own policies. Through the Vinson Acts, by 1942, the American Navy had been successfully built back up to the London Treaty limits, which gave a little more confidence for War Plan Orange. But still, Japan held considerable superiority in the Pacific, so the Americans would design the Royal Road, a plan that anticipated a sustained campaign of island hopping, culminating in a decisive fleet engagement and the fall of Japan. As we'll see, this plan would become essential during the strategies of the Pacific War. Next week, however, we'll return to East Asia as we cover the civil strife.
All right,
see you
folks.
Next week.
Yes, we will. Yes, we will. So, I guess I will give my closing thoughts for this. Obviously, all of you watching, myself and Daniel, watching the history of this, what's usually ignored, especially in American classrooms, is the complexity of what led up to the conflict between the Empire of Japan and the United States in the Second World War. And while I guess the European theater, yes, it is important, gets a lot of the limelight in history and in documentaries, the Pacific theater needs to be covered as well, especially with all the details and complexities with all the then nations and various political figures who were there at the time. I think it's important for us to look at the full story because there are many factors, factions, and situations that led up to the buildup of a war. This all takes time. It just doesn't happen with the snap of a finger. It's always a buildup. There are reasons, choices that are made, and the consequences that follow. To quote somebody from a famous science fiction series I respect a lot, the choices are easy. It's the consequences that are difficult. Yeah. So there you go. All right. Daniel, any other words that you would like to add in here too?
I mean, again, it's very cool to see this because you can just see how and why everything played out, not just in that period they talked about, but all the periods before. You can see how also just different change in who's president made such a tremendous difference to this outcome. So you had, obviously, I mean, again, imagine if Teddy got another term, world would be very different.
I again, it would be interesting to see because after his 2 terms, what would the world look like if he did choose to run for a 3rd term? Would things still change, or would they be different? Who knows? But that's for other YouTube channels to discuss about. We're here to learn and follow history with facts and truth. So there you go. All right. Thank you so much for watching us. Be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe, and also support the original content creators, Kings and Generals, as well. My name is Kit. This is Daniel. Take care, everyone, and see you next time.